Who needs a business strategy when you've got someone else's legacy to drag around? It's NES Works Gaiden episode 70.
You seem a decent fellow. I hate to kill you.
You seem a decent fellow. I hate to die.
The story of the Atari 7800 would not be complete unless we also dig into the story of its idiot sibling, the XE Game System. It may seem hard to believe, but this adorable little vaporwave-looking system is probably the biggest Atari misstep since the 5200. Which is kind of funny when you think about it, since internally the XEGS is more or less a beefed-up 5200. It doesn't play 5200 games though, which is precisely what I'm talking about. It's tempting to pin the travails of Atari Corp on its leadership, but the truth is that Jack Tramiel was simply upholding the legacy that he purchased. The underlying messiness of the XEGS simply goes to show that things were a mess at Atari, whatever Atari you're talking about, all along. And as I've mentioned before and will continue mentioning until everyone watching these videos internalizes it, Atari Inc. broke into Atari Games and Atari Corp. After Time Warner said, "This video games thing is a real money loser." Atari's game design talent bought Atari Games as a sort of cooperative venture from Namco, while the home consumer side of Atari Inc. ended up with Atari Corp., including a ton of new old stock left over from before the console industry collapsed in the US. Atari Corp. Ended up with warehouses full of 2,600 consoles that were just sitting around, ready to be dumped on the market. At the same time, the new company also inherited the 7800 console and its initial lineup. Atari Inc. had prepared the 7800 for a 1984 launch, which ended up being scuttled by the fact that no retail chain in America wanted anything to do with console games at the time. Shops were marking unsold Atari carts down to pennies on the dollar, so no one had any desire to get mired in a bunch of new, full-price inventory for a new console launch that would have had to compete against stuff in the endless bargain bins. So really, Atari didn't have the chance to ship the 7800 to retail until about half a year after the NES's initial launch, which it did, along with a healthy supply of excellent arcade conversions that had been collecting dust somewhere in California since 1984. The system's library felt a little dated in 1986, but technically speaking, the 7800 stood up convincingly to the NES. If nothing else, it made for an appealing pickup for fans of home conversions of arcade hits, a style of game sorely lacking in the black box lineup that was the only material available for NES at the time. Unfortunately, the 7800 had to overcome a big problem, namely Atari, by which I mean, of course, Atari Corp. Atari Corp was headed up by Jack Tramiel, formerly of Commodore, and his home computer background translated into a personal bias that favored computers over game systems. As it happens, Atari Corp. Had acquired all of Atari Inc.'s old PC stock, as well as their consoles, and they continued to ship those machines to retail as Tramiel focused the bulk of his new company's development resources into creating a competitor to the Commodore Amiga, the Atari ST. Atari Corp.'s efforts with the ST were as sharp as its console strategy was chaotic. Yes, Atari had launched the 7800 as a new machine, but at the same time it continued to sell those remainder 2600s as a budget system at a fraction of the 7800's price. Rather than creating synergy with the 7800, the 2600's positioning as a low-budget option undercut the appeal of the newer, more powerful console. The 7800 offered backward compatibility with 2600 games right out of the box, but Atari didn't promote that dual-platform versatility in a way that did it any favors. Enter the XEGS, which at the time of its autumn 1987 debut became the fourth Atari console to receive active support with new software releases. I mean, technically, the final official 5200 release, Gremlins, shipped shortly after the XEGS. And even after that was done, the company was still juggling three consoles, one of which didn't work with the others at all. I suppose at this point I have no choice but to break my "we don't talk about the rabbit hole that is computer gaming" rule for NES Works and its attendant projects, because you can't understand the XEGS without understanding Atari's home computer legacy. Atari debuted its home computer line in 1979, 2 years after the 2600 console, presenting it as a competitive counterpart to the Apple II. While it lacked many of the features that Apple had built into its system, such as sheer expandability, the machines, namely the low-cost 400 and the premium 800, had dazzling graphical capabilities for its era, thanks to some tech wizardry by engineer Jay Miner. That made the Atari 8-bit computer family a natural home for video games, a synergy reinforced by the fact that the system could accept both diskettes and the quick-to-load solid-state cartridges. Atari's computers never caught up to Apple's line in terms of sales, but these machines still sold millions of units, in large part because of their appeal to game lovers. For a few years, no other home gaming platform could begin to compare, tech-wise, to a top-of-the-line Atari home computer. A few years after that, Atari Inc. recognized that the 2600 had begun to look long in the tooth compared to the Intellivision, not to mention forthcoming systems like ColecoVision and Emerson Arcadia, so they decided to freshen up the line. At this point, they made a decision that was almost very smart, until they took the wrong exit and ended up in Idiot Town, namely to adapt their home computer line into a new console. This new system would lack compatibility with the 2600's extensive library, which would be a shame. But bringing those dazzling Atari 800 visuals to the family TV seemed like a worthwhile trade-off. It was a pretty strong instinct, honestly. The Atari computers had originally been conceived as a next-generation console in the first place, and they ran on the same chip that Nintendo would use in its world-conquering Famicom a year later. And besides, the Atari 8-bit line had a massive library of cartridges by the time the 2600 needed a successor. Surely building the new system around its tech would mean that consumers could tap into that extensive catalog, more than making up for the newfound obsolescence of their 2600 carts. Except, that didn't happen. For some reason, despite using the same internal components as Atari's computers, the 5200 couldn't run 8-bit computer software, or vice versa. Some of that may come down to cost-saving measures, since the company's engineers stripped out some memory elements from the console, but a more widely touted theory is that it ultimately reflects Atari Inc.'s internal rivalries. Rather than working together, the console division and the computer division wanted their products to stand apart from one another and created this artificial distinction. Admittedly, I'm not sure that the average consumer understood what a near miss the 5200 was. They simply saw a console that ran incredible-looking games, but couldn't run their existing 2600 carts, and worse, Atari seemed to expect them to buy a lot of the same games all over again for this new machine. Had the 5200 landed in 1982 with Atari 8-bit cart compatibility and, say, extensibility for Atari 8-bit elements like a keyboard and disk drive, it likely would have fared far better and not have been officially discontinued within 2 years of its debut. It would have played hundreds of carts on day one. It would have leapfrogged ColecoVision and its long-delayed upgrade path to the Atom home computer. It could have been great. Instead, the 5200 ended up a brief flicker that didn't even begin to approach the popularity of other Atari systems, and only served to feed the confusion and consumer malaise that resulted in the console crash. If anyone remembers the 5200, it's not for its incredible computer-like power or its forward-thinking support for 4 players simultaneously. No, it's for that crappy analog joystick. Fast forward half a decade. Nintendo sort of forcibly shook American retailers by the lapels until they relented and started stocking video games again. That included games and consoles from Atari. So back to 1987. The 7800 is the backward-compatible 2600 successor that the world wanted the 5200 to be. The 2600 continues to truck along with a steady stream of new releases and newly repackaged classics. And over on the computer side, the aging Atari 8-bit line still ticks away in the background. Hardly competitive with current machines like the IBM PC and Apple Macintosh, but a succession of low-cost packages and an extensive library of software and games make it an appealing starter system. At this point, Jack Tramiel, standing atop the Atari Corp mountain, surveying all he sees, makes a bold decision. Let's turn this computer line into a games console, again. Thus, the Atari XE Game System. Finally, the console that the 5200 should have been 5 years earlier. Though ridiculously, it still didn't ship with compatibility for the 5200 library, even though it probably could have included a simple hardware compatibility mode to make it happen. No, the XEGS was literally just a consoleized version of Atari's low-cost 65XE home computer. Where the 7800 built on the 2600's legacy as a console and even shared a number of components, like its audio chip, the XEGS drew upon the computer legacy that Atari Corp had inherited. The console even shipped with a keyboard right there in the box, along with a cartridge of Flight Simulator 2 and a comically massive manual, making its nature as a computer undeniable. But it also shipped with a recolored version of the classic Atari 2600 joystick, and a light gun, and it included both RF and surprisingly high-quality composite video output options, which framed it as a console. Atari Corp added further extensibility hooks into the system too, incorporating a single cartridge slot, but leaving the door open to the addition of a diskette drive. Again, it's not hard to imagine a world in which this machine shipped in 1982 instead of the 5200. It wouldn't have prevented the American console crash from happening, but it might have created a greater sense of continuity for US consoles between the two halves of the 1980s, since computers never went away like consoles did. A 5200 like this could have been a bridge between markets during that pre-NES lacuna. Instead, we ended up with a machine that arrived far too late to make a difference anywhere. The XEGS was the single least successful console to debut in the US in the second half of the 80s. According to Atari's internal sales figures, some of its games shipped in double-digit quantities, though it should be noted that most of these games had already shipped years earlier as Atari Inc. computer releases. In addition to reissuing a handful of 8-bit carts with a new label to denote XEGS compatibility, Atari Corp also released a new line of about 30 XEGS games in custom packaging. Well, new. Most of them were, again, simply repackaged Atari 8-bit titles. Also, the handful of newly crafted games that Atari did ship for XEGS showed up in slightly different form at around the same time on the 7800 and sometimes even on 2600. While it wasn't unusual for popular games to ship for multiple platforms, this strategy can't have helped any of Atari's products. To give one example, it made sense for Donkey Kong to ship for both the Atari 2600 console in 1982 and the Atari 800 computer a year later. It might have been the same game, but one ran on a low-power, low-cost system, while the other ran on a more expensive machine that offered a superior experience. They existed in different spaces, both literally at stores and figuratively in the end-user's perception. But when Mario Bros. Showed up on both XEGS and 7800 in 1988, two systems that both lived at retail in the console racks, it simply created uncertainty for kids and parents. It didn't help that neither version looked as accurate to the arcade game as Nintendo's own release for the more popular NES 2 years earlier. And on top of that, Atari reissued Mario Bros. For 2600 at the same time in its budget Red Label line, creating a third Atari version of the game for players to pick between. As the last 8-bit console to market in the US, and the system to enjoy the lowest amount of promotion from its manufacturer, the XE Game System had no chance. Despite its incredibly of-the-time pastel buttons and strong unified visual presence at retail. Just kidding, XEGS had no presence at retail. So we're going to be looking at the XEGS library as part of NES Works Gaiden, a side series that increasingly makes me realize I probably should have created a separate header for Japanese Famicom retrospectives as Gaiden, and something totally different for American Atari overviews, but oh well. The XE Game System wasn't much to speak of as a force on American store shelves, or as a thing anyone was particularly clamoring to play. It does, however, give me an excuse to open a small window into the gaming legacy of American computer systems, something normally outside the purview of my videos. So please enjoy this brief and somewhat bleak sidebar over the coming year or so. It's a mess of a system, but as we've seen before, messes can often be more interesting than dull competence. The XEGS shipped with 3 games packed in alongside the hardware. 2 of them, Bug Hunt and Flight Simulator 2, came on cartridges and really just existed to show off the console's peripherals. The third, however, was a freebie, a game programmed into the console itself, Snail Maze for the modern era. Missile Command almost needs no introduction, at least not to the olds in the audience. But even newcomers to gaming undoubtedly have some peripheral awareness of it, given how ubiquitous it's become in pop media. Originally debuting in arcades in 1980, Missile Command harnessed cultural anxiety over the threat of nuclear war into video game form. It's a nihilistic piece of media. Missile Command has no winning state. It's precisely the kind of giddy, panic-inducing experience that designer Dave Thurer specialized in. This was the man who was famously inspired to create Tempest based on his own personal nightmares, after all. When you play Missile Command, you can't save the day. You just keep playing until incoming nuclear missiles wipe out your entire population, and the game ends. Although it made for a pretty dated release all the way in 1987, you can't argue with its inclusion as a freebie, even if the XEGS didn't ship with a trackball controller, which Missile Command really begs for. Then again, a home trackball controller couldn't capture the muscular intensity of the coin-op experience. A fast-paced game that demanded players divide their attention between and respond to multiple simultaneous threats, Missile Command sessions quickly turn into players desperately spinning the cabinet's trackball to move as fast as they can, while still exercising pinpoint precision to take out incoming threats. Missile Command presents you with a pretty straightforward setup that owes its inspiration to the layout of Space Invaders. You need to defend half a dozen cities against a relentless assault from missiles that streak in from overhead. Rather than controlling a small vehicle at the bottom of the screen, however, you instead fire defensive missiles from a fixed central weapons depot. You control a cursor that moves freely through the open air above your cities. The cursor itself doesn't possess offensive capabilities, it simply serves as a targeting device for your defensive weapons. When you press the fire button, your base will launch a missile from the ground that streaks to the point you targeted, whereupon it explodes and creates a short-lived circular blast zone that destroys anything inside the explosion. This home port differs significantly from the arcade game in terms of the player's missile base. In arcade, you controlled 3 different bases spaced evenly across the screen, each with its own supply of ammunition. You fired a weapon from each base with its own corresponding button, and the 3-point defense introduced a crucial element of split-second strategy. The position from which you fired a missile obviously determined how quickly its projectile could reach a given location on the screen, and that made it difficult to properly time a shot from one side of the screen to the other and guarantee it would take out incoming hazards. Since your unseen and unnamed enemy deals primarily in MIRVs that split apart into a spread of projectiles, this means that the longer you take to shoot down an incoming missile, the more likely it is to splinter and create a spread of projectiles that's more difficult to counter and requires you to burn through more of your stockpile. The computer version removes the flanking bases and gives you a single central missile launch point in the middle of the screen. This sands down the difficulty of the game quite a bit, since the central base can hit all points on the screen fairly effectively, and its singular presence means you don't need to manage how quickly you burn through ammo at each stockpile. It's an unfortunate change, but an understandable one. Atari systems were known for their single-button controllers, so Missile Command had to work within the bounds of the existing hardware. And it doesn't ruin the game or anything, just simplifies it. Despite this change, Missile Command on XE Game System, which appears to be the exact same piece of code as the Atari 8-bit port, does a pretty good job of adapting the arcade original. The movement of missiles, the explosive circles, even the alternate enemy delivery weapons like planes and satellites appear here. And if it doesn't present quite the same difficulty level as the coin-op, well, so it goes. It's a free built-in game, Michael. How much could it cost? $10? Next time on NES Works Gaiden, games that no one played on a system that no one bought. Are you feeling as stoked as I am?